Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. Welcome back inside the Ciné Lumière here at the French Institute. We are well into our night of ideas. We've had some extraordinary discussions, extraordinary poems, extraordinary ideas aired and exchanged and debated. Some absolutely fantastic, some absolutely fantastical. But that's the idea of the Night of Ideas, to share and come together. And I think it's been extraordinary to watch the debates on this stage, but I've also gone around the building and found debates about zero waste cooking. I've seen book signings. We've seen young students interviewing people. We've seen discussions in the library. The whole place is buzzing with ideas, and wherever you are in the world watching on YouTube and Facebook, hello, welcome, and I hope you're buzzing wherever you are with the thoughts coming through your screens. We've also been seeing people on the screen here and sharing in the hybrid form that these things now take, and I think we've done it all right, really, don't you? I think it's worked pretty well. The Mayor of Palermo, ladies and gentlemen, in his office with flags and accent, thought that was marvellous. This debate is going to prove, I think, to be absolutely fascinating as well. It's called The State in All Its State. We've all experienced some form of the state in the last 2 years. We've been in a state, we've been looked after by the state to a certain degree, but what more can they do? That's what's going to be discussed here on this stage and on the screen. So the chair tonight, normally I bring the chair up, but the chair is at home in his chair. It's Alain Rusbridger, who's editor-in-chief of Prospect, who are sponsoring tonight. We used to be my editor at The Guardian and The Observer as well. So I hope he's there, Alain. He's our chair. We'll bring him up later. There he is. There he is, surrounded by books. Brilliant. Alan, welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Well, thank you for not coming. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to bring up on stage here Bobby Duffy, ladies and gentlemen, from King's College, London. Bobby will tell you what he does. He's going to be joined by our fantastic interpreter, interprète Karine Kennedy. Karine, welcome. And we need Karine because we're joined online à côté de Alain, un autre Alain, Alain Supiot. Bonsoir, Alain.
Good evening.
So we have your interpreter, Karine, qui est là pour traduire ce que vous dites, si vous en avez besoin.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay, excellent. Before we start, we have a resident poet, ladies and gentlemen, who's been introducing all the themes of the panel with his very succinct and relevant poems composed freshly for tonight in response to the titles. So to give us the state in all its states, please welcome back to the stage here, Anthony Anaxaguru.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Good to see you. So this is a poem that responds to the theme of the states in all its states. What I vote for and what I get are two different things. I wanted a country free of neckties and plastic, but what do I find if not the floating fish or a discounted magic wand? I'll take whatever I can get heavy with, lick sound bites clean until I'm burping out sexy promises. My posture is getting worse with every bad faith take, interview, clickbait media. I'll tell you what I told my father the night before he drained the tank. If I die because of an idea, make sure you leave my most obscure adjectives to the guy in blonde. Keep still his open mouth, don't worry about his small hands, floxinoxin, and all that good old-fashioned stuff. My father wanted to be Elvis. He knew all the songs. One night I asked him, why Elvis? He said, because like any good king, you take what isn't yours and learn to walk with it. Nobody laughed. I'll leave my podium mic on, have a party with the rest of my party while the rest of the country waits by the curtain. I love how death teaches us how best to live, and I miss the dead in all their states. I've drank from a hilltop, a ravine, and dropped loose change into the hat of a homeless man who nodded as if he knew. Tomorrow when I get in from work, I'm going to sit at my desk to write my letter to the Prime Minister, addressed to nobody in particular, a country unpicking itself, a country, my country, nonetheless.
Anthony Anaxaguru, ladies and gentlemen, as ever, giving us poetic food for thought before we start our debate. I'll now hand you over to the Editor-in-Chief of Prospect, Alain Rusbridger, and the rest of our panel. We'll see you after the questions at the end.
Thanks so much. I hope everybody can hear. Everyone is used to these hybrid events, and we're respectively in London and Nantes, and Alain and I have got competing libraries, and I'm rather envious of Alain's library. I think his library is bigger than mine. But here we are, and in the hall you have Bobby and Karine. I must say we met the other night, and Alain's English was so amazing that I'm amazed that we need Karine, but nevertheless Alain is going to be speaking in French. So let me introduce the two main speakers today. So Alain Supiot is Professor Emeritus in Law at the Collège de France, where he held the chair of Social State and Globalization. He is corresponding member of the British Academy, holds honorary doctorates from many universities, and his work has mainly been in two complementary fields, labor law and legal theory. And in the hall, we have Bobby Duffy, who's Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Policy Institute. He's worked across most public policy areas, including being seconded to the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. He wrote The Perils of Perception, and also does Why We're Wrong About Nearly Everything on Misperceiving Social Realities, and Generations, does When You're Born Shape Who You Are. I know from talking to them the other night, this is going to be a fascinating session. I'm going to ask Alain, aided by the wonderful Karine, to start. And I've given him slightly longer because to allow for the translation. And then we'll have Bobby, and then I know we're going to have an interesting discussion between the two. So Alain, please lead off.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you also to the organization of this night to allow me to speak in French, and perhaps you'll understand why. I have 2 points of entry. J'ai 2 points d'entrée dans le sujet ce soir. 2 questions pour introduire notre discussion. La première est de savoir de quoi l'État est le nom, de quoi parlons-nous quand nous parlons d'État. Et la seconde est de faire un diagnostic de l'État, d'un État qui me paraît aujourd'hui schizophrène. Donc peut-être Karine.
Merci beaucoup. So first of all, there are 2 initial points that I'd like to make. First of all, when we're talking about the state, what do we mean by the state? What does that actually mean? And secondly, do we consider the state to be schizophrenic?
Alors, les sociétés humaines, à la différence des agrégats animaux, ne sont pas un monde plat. Il y a un professeur de mathématiques anglais très brillant de la fin du 20e, monsieur Abbott, du 19e, qui a écrit « Flatland », est un livre que je vous recommande. En réalité, dans toute société humaine, il faut postuler l'existence d'un tiers qui est garant de la justice, de la paix civile et de l'état des personnes. Et l'État est une figure de ce tiers, une figure relativement récente, puisqu'il a été inventé au XIIe siècle par la papauté, par les juristes canonistes, lors de ce qu'on a appelé la révolution grégorienne, avant d'être exporté dans le monde entier.
So human society is not just simply a flat word, as it were. In fact, there's a very famous English maths professor who at the end of the 19th century, and I recommend you to read him, he wrote a book called Flatland. His name was Abbott. So essentially, a third party has got to be responsible for justice, civil state, and the state of the people. The state was particularly mentioned in the 12th century by people who were writing papal canons.
Alors, de quoi parlons-nous quand nous parlons d'État? Je vais prendre la question d'abord d'une façon sémantique et comparative, et ensuite d'une façon historique.
So when we talk about the state, what are we talking about? So I'm going to talk about it from a semantic point of view and from a historic point of view.
L'une des difficultés des sciences sociales, c'est qu'elles pensent que leurs catégories de pensée sont universelles, alors qu'en réalité, elles s'inscrivent toutes dans la culture occidentale et qu'elles ont ainsi des difficultés à saisir la complexité du monde. Cette difficulté est du reste renforcée lorsqu'on ne parle plus que dans une seule langue, ce qui tend à être le cas aujourd'hui. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle je me suis permis cette coquetterie de faire entendre le français ici ce soir.
So one of the difficulties of social science is that it's considered that as far as that it's Western social science that counts. But in fact, there are a number of languages that are involved, and that's why I decided to spoil myself this evening, or to be coquettish enough for you to ensure that you could actually also hear French spoken.
Alors, l'état, c'est un mot qui vient du latin status, et qui signifie quelque chose qui est stable, qui tient debout.
So the state comes from the word status, which is Latin, obviously, and status means it stays upright, it holds.
Si vous prenez le mot arabe, c'est douala, qui en perse aussi connote à la fois le bonheur, la prospérité et son caractère passager, c'est-à-dire l'idée d'une rotation continuelle.
And the state in Arabic and also in Persian is called a dwala. And dwala is a word that gives the impression of happiness, prosperity, and also the transient character of the world. And in other words, there's a continuous rotation.
Si l'on prend maintenant le monde orthodoxe, je prends seulement le grec, l'État se dit kratos, ce qui renvoie uniquement à la notion de pouvoir, alors que la stabilité, l'autorité se dit archeis. Donc vous voyez que cette petite exploration linguistique montre qu'il faut se défier de l'idée d'une universalité du concept d'État qui peut être la source de malentendus.
So we have to realize that, in fact, the concept of state is that there isn't a concept of state that is the same everywhere. For example, in Greek, you talk about kratos, which relates to the semantic of power. But so therefore, authority and stability, which is attached to state in all Western Europe, even in English.
Et si l'on prend seulement l'Europe occidentale, pour un Français, l'État, c'est quelque chose de central parce que c'est l'État qui a fait la nation. En revanche, l'Italie, si vous parlez à des Italiens de l'État, ils disent « Il Stato è Roma, e Roma ci sono i ladri ». C'est Rome, et Rome, c'est des voleurs, parce que la tradition italienne, elle a été faite par des cités-États, et l'État est une construction relativement très récente. Et si je prends maintenant l'Allemagne, sa tradition, c'est celle d'un Reich, une tradition impériale, donc d'une communauté de communautés sans territoire clairement défini. Quant aux Anglais, je ne me permettrai pas d'être très long sur l'Angleterre, mais je m'en tiendrai à un de mes maîtres, Montesquieu, qui décrit l'Angleterre comme un prince toujours chancelant sur un trône inébranlable. Donc la notion d'État me paraît moins centrale que celle de la couronne.
So as far as Western Europe itself is concerned, in France, for example, the state makes the nation, and that's why the nation is so central. That's certainly not the case in Italy, because the Italians always say, tutti i ladri sono a Roma. In other words, there are lots of burglars or people that are thieves in Rome. So as far as Italy is concerned, the idea is that there are city-states. And in Germany, which of course has inherited an imperial tradition, they're talking about communities or communities of communities. But as far as the English are concerned, they can probably recognize themselves more as far as being the crown of the state, or at least if I believe Montesquieu, who observed, he said, a prince is always wavering on his throne that can't be moved in any way, but that can still be discussed, or it's up to the British to discuss that.
Alors, si l'on prend maintenant une perspective historique sur l'État, on peut dire qu'il a subi depuis cette invention au Moyen-Âge une série de révolutions. Je vais être très bref. Le moment le plus important dont nous sommes les héritiers, ce sont les révolutions anglaises, américaines et françaises qui inventent l'État constitutionnel, c'est-à-dire un État qui s'auto-limite. Il est émancipé de l'autorité de la religion, mais il s'auto-limite parce que, justement, Montesquieu a appelé la séparation des pouvoirs, c'est-à-dire un système où le pouvoir doit pouvoir arrêter le pouvoir. Et c'est ça que les Français ont appelé, les Allemands ont appelé l'état de droit, les Anglais le rule of law et les Français la République.
So if we look at the history of the state, at the English history of the state, American and French, basically the states want to impose self-limitations and to be emancipated from religion. And if we look at what Harold Berman said, he talked about the rule, not the rule by law, but he talked about the rule of law.
Bon, alors, le tournant qui est pris au XIXe siècle est un tournant scientiste, c'est-à-dire que cette construction de l'État constitutionnel va être critiquée par une série de savants qui prétendent que les vraies lois ne peuvent pas venir de l'État parce que les vraies lois, elles sont inscrites dans la nature, ce sont des lois scientifiques. Certains les ont cherchées dans la biologie, ce qui a donné la lutte des races, certains dans l'histoire économique, ce qui a donné la lutte des classes, et puis d'autres l'ont cherché dans le marché, dans des lois de l'économie, qui seraient les vraies lois qu'il faut obéir. Et dans ce cas, l'État n'est plus qu'un instrument au service d'une avant-garde qui connaît ces lois et qui va en imposer le respect à des masses ignorantes.
So essentially, the state had been constantly criticized by wise men, and they considered
Not really wise,
okay. Learned men, sorry. Well, yeah, okay, fine. And they were talking about it being inscribed in nature, but we've encountered, for example, from a biological point of view, there was racial wars. From an equality point of view, there were class wars. From an economical point of view, there were market wars. So essentially, the state was at the service of the nation.
Et cette idée que l'État est un pur instrument, vous la trouvez aussi bien chez Lénine que chez l'un des pères du néolibéralisme, qui est Friedrich Hayek, qui compare le rôle des gouvernants à celui d'un horloger qui met de l'huile dans une horloge.
And so this idea of the state as being an instrument is very close to what Lenin felt, but also that Friedrich Hayek talked about running of the state being very similar, to someone who was taking care of clocks and who would oil the clocks.
Alors, j'en viens donc, pour terminer au dernier point, c'est l'état schizophrénique des temps présents.
So I come to my last point, which is that of the schizophrenic state of present times.
Aujourd'hui, tant à l'échelle nationale qu'à l'échelle internationale, deux conceptions opposées de l'État sont aujourd'hui aux prises.
So today, at a national level and also at an international level, there are two opposed ideas of the state that exist.
La première, c'est celle que nous devons au sursaut juridique et moral de la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. La Seconde Guerre mondiale.
The first one is the one that we actually have inherited at the dogmatic upsurge after the Second World War.
L'expérience des atrocités de 1914 et 1945 a conduit les démocraties occidentales à essayer de refonder un nouvel ordre sur la justice et la coopération, la solidarité entre les nations et le respect de droits qui ont été étendus aux questions, à la condition physique des personnes et qui leur ont donné aussi des droits de démocratie économique et sociale. C'est ce qu'on a appelé l'État social. Donc, c'est la grande invention du XXe siècle et qui a restauré la légitimité de l'État de droit.
So the major invention of the 20th century was really to restore the legitimacy of the rule of law. And this is what happened after the two world wars.
Ça, c'est la première conception dont nous sommes les héritiers. Mais il y en a une seconde qui est nous sommes aussi les héritiers de cette tradition instrumentale qui, aujourd'hui, ne voit dans l'État que l'instrument d'un ordre spontané du marché, et cet instrument ne doit pas être jugé par un critère de justice, mais par un critère d'efficacité. Et c'est ainsi que au rule of law se substitue la gouvernance par les nombres, les calculs d'utilité individuelle qui seraient le vrai moteur du fonctionnement des sociétés.
And the second aspect is that which is an instrumental aspect, which is almost that of the person who's taking care of clocks. In other words, the spontaneous order of markets, which has got to be managed itself as though it were a company. In other words, new public management. And it's not a question of referring to an ideal of justice, but to a constraint of efficiency. And the rule of law is substituted by governance through figures, through numbers and through techniques.
Alors, pour conclure, je dirais que la crise du Covid a été, pour cette conception instrumentale, une sorte de choc avec le réel qui a obligé à redécouvrir la fonction de l'État comme garant de la vie de la société sur le long terme. Mais l'on peut craindre.
With COVID, we were shocked, and we were suddenly faced with reality, and the state had to become a guarantor of life.
Mais on peut craindre que ne se reproduise l'expérience de la crise financière de 2008. Là aussi, la foi dans l'ordre spontané avait conduit à une implosion financière. Les États ont été convoqués pour sauver comme garantie ultime, et une fois qu'ils se sont endettés pour sauver les marchés financiers, eh bien, on a pris argument de ces dettes pour reprendre le cours de leur instrumentalisation et de leur paupérisation. Et on peut faire le pronostic que ce scénario va se reproduire, et s'il se reproduit malheureusement, on peut craindre le développement de la violence, parce qu'en l'absence de cette clé de voûte institutionnelle qu'est l'État, eh bien, il n'y a plus place que pour les relations entre amis et ennemis, c'est-à-dire des relations violentes. Voilà, je vous remercie de votre attention et je vous remercie, Karine, de la qualité de votre traduction.
Well, the 2008 financial crisis certainly gave rise to certain implosion, and we could be concerned that after COVID, we could be faced with the same kind of situation, that there once again will be some violence.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Alain, for that fascinating introduction, and also Karine for your excellent translation. Let me hand over now to Bobby for your introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Alain. My focus is going to be much more narrow and recent than Alain's absolutely fascinating, sweeping view of the state and its historical influences. But it's still going to be quite long. It's quite a long-range view as well. It's based on my book on generations, which really looks at trends over the past 50 or 60 years, and in particular about the relationship between citizens and the state. And there are a couple of important points from that I think give a slightly more optimistic view than some other high-profile accounts of the state, and in particular in that relationship point in our connection to the state. So there's a constant suggestion that we're at constant new crisis points on a range of factors in our relationship with the state in terms of our belief in democracy and our trust in politicians. And while we shouldn't be overly positive about these aspects, we also shouldn't. We have to be careful not to talk ourselves into these types of crises, because when you look at the trend data on this over the past 50, 60 years across different sorts of countries, there are no particularly strong trends towards a uniform rejection of democratic connection across lots of different countries. It goes in lots of different directions, but quite a lot of it is positive. And while it's true that trust in politicians is low, that's a chronic, not an acute condition. We've got this we have this very strong tendency towards rosy retrospection, where we forget the bad from the past and we think that we're in a constant new crisis. But when I look back in terms of the book at op-eds from the 1970s or statements from people from 1970s about the state of our democracy and connection to democracy, it could be written today in terms of exactly the same sort of language and exactly the same sort of sense of inevitable crisis and calamity. And within that, particularly my interest from a generational perspective, which of these are true generational trends, it's often the view that it's younger generations that are driving this, that they're the ones that don't have the memory of what came before or the gains that we've made over the past few decades, and are utterly disconnected from political institutions. But again, that is not the case when you look at the evidence about young people's connection. When you look at trust levels, for example, in a whole range of different state bodies, from government through to organs like the police, it's actually younger generations tend to have higher levels of trust in those types of institutions when they come into adulthood. Trust is something that we lose through repeated disappointments rather than it being a generational break. So that's not to say, though, that there are no important generational trends in our values or our relationship with the state, and it's much more to do with efficacy than trust, and what we're focusing on because of a long-term value shift that we've seen in citizens and the state. So as people like Ron Inglehart and others have shown, there's been this long generational drift across most countries from what he calls survival values, which are very focused on security and a strong role for government in giving those to us, to more self-expression values. Post-Second World War, countries have gone in at different speeds on this, but it's been a general drift from survival values to self-expression values. As basic needs are met, we can move on more to expressing our identity in different ways, and particularly in cultural expressions of our identity in terms of increased individualism, increased tolerance for others. But the recent trends show some signs of cultural backlash in the last few years, and we've seen that play out in different ways across different countries, in mainland Europe, in the UK, obviously with Brexit, with Trump in the US, where that drifting back to a focus on survival values, going alongside the stalling of economic progress for lots of individuals, go hand in hand for increasing proportions of the population, where that sense of economic stalling pushes people back to more of a focus on survival values from that drift towards self-expression values. So a couple of things happen when that happens. When progress stalls, first of all, we tend to look more to nation states for protection and looking after our own interest. But secondly, you also see increased sense of competition and resentment between groups, because that competition is increased because no one is making much progress. So group identities come more to the fore, where there's less to go round. Who you're for or against becomes much more important, particularly that sense of generation on generation progress stalling. So we can see that in really interesting analysis of how the balance of political focus has shifted. There was a great piece of work looking across 21 countries, analysing the content of political manifestos back to the 1950s to today. And the salience of cultural issues in policy discussions has more than doubled, as economic salience has declined over that period. So those dividing lines around immigration, integration, but more broadly, how comfortable people are with culture change, and then increasingly framed as culture wars, not just in the US, but in the UK and leaking into lots of other countries with wokeism, concern about wokeism, etc., is coming more to the center of our politics, which encourages this sense of generational divides within countries in particular. And of course, then the pandemic. As is so often with the pandemic, it's ruthlessly exposed existing vulnerabilities and pushed us farther and faster down the roads that we're already on. And again, that's relevant in a couple of ways from the role of the state, for a view on the role of the state. Because, I mean, the real story of the last decade or so has been much more about polarization or fragmentation. And we see that also emphasized in our analysis of comfort with state intervention during the pandemic. So we've ran a whole series of analysis segmenting the population into different types of group. And it shows that the large bulk of the public in different countries were quite comfortable with the state actually having a much more interventionist role in their lives and actually asking for more under these emergency conditions. But there was this significant minority railing against it. But then also, crucially, rolling in other issues into that sense of too great state intervention into their lives and other types of cultural concerns. And within the polarization literature, there's a concept called conflict extension that leads to these types of culture war divides, where more and more issues are rolled into this, your identity, your group identity, so that it forms a mega identity where your position on lots and lots of different issues become tied up with your political identity, not just your individual views on each individual issue. And the problem with that is when each time that you activate one of those identities, it strengthens that overall identity. So it becomes quite self-fulfilling, self-reinforcing as a trend. This focus on culture, putting that at the heart of our politics as a long-term trend, then particular events like Brexit and the pandemic making that more pointy for people. But the second way in which the pandemic affects us is one of the most worrying trends that I see in the book and all the analysis that we've done is a loss of faith in a better future for our kids and future generations more generally. So there are some shocking figures, including from France. In fact, France is the lowest of all the countries that we've surveyed in terms of its optimism that today's youth will have a better future than their parents. Only 13% of people in France believe that, compared to like 70% in less developed countries. That was even before the pandemic, and we know it tends to be a high level of pessimism in France for future trends. That is true, but the key point here is that is a turnaround from 20 or 30 years ago, where it was a much larger proportion of people who thought the future was going to be better. So that's very worrying, because that's already the position before the long, difficult road out of the pandemic starts. But I don't want to finish on that quite pessimistic note. The final point, I think, is that generational perspectives, this view of how our relationships with the state and each other are changing generation on generation, can lead people to conclude quite pessimistically that crisis is inevitable. There's a whole series of work from the US, very influential work from the US by writers Strauss and Howe, including a book called The Fourth Turning, that was in fact one of Steve Bannon's favorite books, and he did a very strange documentary on it, which predicts that there's this 80-year cycle of crisis, depending on what combination of types of generations you have at a particular time. But that doesn't work that well as a study of history. You can debunk it quite easily, as that is not the pattern that you see. But what I see from looking at the actual trends over the past 50 or 60 years is that you can actually turn things around in terms of people's views, trust and sense of efficacy in their relationship with the state. Over this 50 or 60 year period, it has lots of times looked like all is lost and there's no way back from these types of crises. But having that longer sweep shows that we have bounced back. And the key message that I take from all of that is that we still have agency to shape our better future if we understand our relationship with the state. Thank you.
Thank you both. I forgot, Alain, that I was supposed to tell Bobby to speak slowly so that you could understand, but I hope you got most of that. I wonder if we could begin a dialogue between you talking about COVID, and because I think it would be very interesting to compare the experience of the two countries. So you've both touched on this in your introductory remarks, that at the height of the COVID crisis, we were relying on the state for vaccines, for protective equipment, for tracking and tracing, for enormous amounts of financial support and bailing out of companies. And yet both of you referred to the backlash against that as well. How do you think that the long-term perception of the role of the state in COVID will have impacted on our relationship with the state, as it were, in peacetime once COVID is over. Alain, do you want to address that first? Because the perception in France may be different from the UK.
C'est très difficile de prédire quels vont être les effets à long terme de cette crise. L'État est intervenu. Oui,
effects, c'est gentil. It's very difficult to predict the long-term effects of this crisis.
Oui, l'État est intervenu, bien sûr, comme l'a dit Bobby, pour comme une sorte de garant de la survie et aussi de la survie économique. Mais quand j'ai parlé d'État schizophrène tout à l'heure, je crois qu'une des difficultés en France, c'est que nous avons les deux discours qui sont tenus en même temps. Vous savez, en même temps, c'est une devise sur laquelle s'est fait élire le président Macron. Moi, j'y vois un symptôme de ce déchirement entre, d'une part, une logique de désengagement de l'État de ses responsabilités sociales, et puis une logique de réaffirmation de son rôle de garant. Donc, nous sommes dans cette contradiction. Et parce que l'État libéral ou post-libéral n'est pas nécessairement un État bénin. Le modèle pour Hayek, et même pour Madame Thatcher, ils ont eu beaucoup d'admiration pour Pinochet, la dictature Pinochet. Donc, on a vu ces deux tendances s'exprimer pendant le Covid, avec un contrôle des populations plus grand que jamais. Je laisse Karine, et puis j'aurai une petite réflexion de plus.
So essentially, as Bobby said, the state has intervened as a kind of guarantor from a social point of view, not from a social point of view, from an economic point of view. So the state is in a schizophrenic state, and there are two discourses that can be looked at or thought of. For example, Macron was elected, and so the symptom of that particular election was because there was a disengagement from the state from a social point of view, but the state nevertheless acted as guarantor. So there was a kind of contradiction. So the state, in a post-liberal state, so basically there wasn't a belief in the post-liberal state. So, for example, Hayek talks about Thatcher. Hayek and Thatcher were both admired Pinochet, for example.
Et oui, je voulais une dernière remarque. On voit en France actuellement une prolongation des mesures de contrôle de la population et des techniques qui ne relèvent pas du droit, mais qui relèvent des techniques comportementalistes, de ce qu'on appelle les nudges, qui sont tellement à la mode et qui ont valu des prix Nobel d'économie à leurs auteurs. C'est-à-dire, on va considérer les êtres humains comme des chiens de Pavlov que l'on peut amener à bien se comporter en leur envoyant les bons signaux. La dernière manifestation de cela, et je termine sur cette remarque, c'est lorsque le président de la République, il y a quelques jours, a dit qu'il ne voulait pas faire une obligation juridique de se vacciner, mais ce qu'il allait faire, c'est emmerder les non-vaccinés, c'est-à-dire c'est des techniques comportementalistes. Et ça, c'est les signes de cet état quand même très, très policier, très peu démocratique. Et tout cela est présent dans la situation actuelle en France, hein, à la fois des promesses de réengagement dans les services publics, notamment dans la santé, et puis tous les symptômes d'une tentation autoritaire qui s'écarte des voies du droit.
So just one other comment. As far as France is concerned, there's definitely a control of the population. It's a sort of technique which is used a behaviorist technique, we particularly refers to nudges, which is something that's considered to be very fashionable. So essentially, it's as if human beings are being treated as though they were Pavlovian dogs, that you send them the right signs and then they'll behave accordingly. A few days ago, the President of the Republic specified that, or stated that he wasn't going to oblige people to get vaccinated, but he just did want to land them in the shit. So the state is really not particularly democratic. And it makes promises, for example, is saying that that health will be taken care of, but that's not necessarily the case.
Bobby, can you reflect the comparative position as you see it in the UK?
Yeah, no, really. I wish we could go more into that nudge point, but just from a sort of bigger picture point of view, I think there is, it's such an extreme intervention into people's lives that I guess the key theme for me in this is the one I kind of mentioned in the introduction, is that it fragments and polarizes the reactions from the public, from citizens. And I think there's people that are equally worried about the extent to which people are now being conditioned into too readily accepting authoritarian or overweening intervention into their lives. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's good evidence of people being pushed into conspiracism and then radicalization that comes from going down those sorts of rabbit holes. So it's the extremity of the intervention pushes people to extremes, and that is both directions. And I think I don't know, I think there may be parallels in, there's at least echoes of Alain's talk about schizophrenic state in terms of public reaction, because it is accentuating those extremities, I would say. So that's the biggest effect of the short-term element. But I think, as Alain, was saying at the beginning there, the real challenge here is how we come out, or how we come back. The legacy implications for relationship between citizen and state, and how the state of the state more generally is, can we achieve that sense of building back better? Can we actually shift the dial in the sense that we are not into terminal decline of generation on generation, things getting worse or certainly not getting better? So it is that longer term view will be the one that has the biggest impact, but hard to be too optimistic about those types of step changes in a better future being created from where we are now.
I wonder if we could project a little forward, because there are some people who think that the experience we've just been through with COVID is like a dress rehearsal for climate change. And I guess our reaction to the interventions of, you might say, relatively modest interventions of the state compared with what might be necessary in the next generation on climate change, we're going to learn a lot about how much citizens trust their states and how much they're willing to be nudged or coerced into patterns of behavior and consumption that may be very different from what we've lived through in the last generation. I wonder if either of you can project forward a little and say what we've learned from COVID that might lend us to understand how the state is going to behave, making some very unpopular decisions over the next 20 or 30 years. Alain.
Oui, je me référerai à un mot qui a beaucoup employé, à juste titre, Bobby dans sa présentation, qui est trust. C'est-à-dire, l'État, c'est une construction fiduciaire. Ça ne relève pas des sciences naturelles. Ça repose sur des systèmes de croyances et d'adhésion. Et lorsque, par exemple, on démantèle les systèmes de solidarité qui étaient construits de façon démocratique, on n'aboutit pas à la poussière d'individus qui étaient espérés par le néolibéralisme, parce que les individus se regroupent sur des bases tribales, dans cette logique ami-ennemi que j'ai découvert tout à l'heure. Donc, pour répondre d'un mot à votre question, Alain, je pense que l'histoire montre que dans des crises très graves, une nation peut se ressouder autour de son État. L'Angleterre a été un modèle extraordinaire de cette capacité pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Donc, de ce point de vue, je ne crois pas qu'on puisse tirer des leçons pessimistes du Covid. Le problème, c'est de restaurer ce trust, cette confiance entre une classe dirigeante de plus en plus déconnectée des conditions de la vie réelle. On a l'impression qu'ils n'entendent plus que des signaux très faibles venant de la Terre. Et de l'autre côté, effectivement, les partis les plus modestes de la population se désintéressent du politique, ne votent plus, ou alors se réfugient dans ces attitudes tribales. Mais c'est la disparition d'un horizon commun qui explique cette fragmentation. Donc, si vous voulez, merci Karine de votre patience, alors qu'on nous annonçait la société liquide, c'est de Zygmunt Bauman, eh bien, ce n'est pas liquide, ça se forme comme des grumeaux et dans des logiques qui peuvent porter la violence. Mais face à des crises très graves, nous avons l'expérience de la capacité de ces nations de se ressouder.
So essentially, states are able to kind of weld themselves together again. Britain certainly demonstrated that after the Second World War. And Zygmunt Bauman talked about how a society, which is a liquid society, suddenly can not be so liquid at all and would have lots of pieces in it. I'd just like to refer to a word that Bobby used. He talked about trust. And basically, the state is a fiduciary construct. It's not a natural science, and it's born from a system of beliefs, of belonging. Individuals get together tribally, they're friends or they're enemies. And to answer your question just in one word, I mean, in serious crises, the state definitely can re-weld itself.
Yeah, I think if you're picking out one particular theme of how people have reacted is the incredible acceptance of incredible restrictions on how we've lived. I mean, the challenge here is, of course, that's in the face of an immediate threat to people where you're very focused on your survival instincts and those kind of survival values during a pandemic. It's much more difficult in the chronic short-termism that we have around climate change if the threat is more in the future and theoretical. So I guess it's yes, there may well be bigger challenges to come from climate, but will they feel as immediate and immediately threatening to people? Because that will be the one of the key drivers of how accepting people are of those types of interventions. I mean, but I think it's important to keep hold of the fact, particularly in the UK, that we had this sense at the beginning of the crisis that there was going to be behavioural fatigue and the public would never take the types of interventions that they were being asked to live with. But actually, not only did they take them, they were asking for greater restrictions. So I think there is there is the potential within the public to accept that quite readily, but it depends on the sense of threat. Which was obviously very immediate and real. Climate's going to be more complex.
I wonder if either of you would like to reflect on, if I throw Singapore into the conversation. There's been during Brexit, we were told that London was going to be Singapore on Thames, but there are some people who think we actually are not going to get through the challenges that we have to face unless we become a bit more like Singapore, i.e. by that I mean a more authoritarian government in which you need that kind of top-down state intervention in order to instruct people what is necessary to do in order to survive. So nudge and behavioral theory is fine at a time, as you say, where there's an immediate threat, but actually, if we're going to make the big sacrifices and changes in our lives, then maybe even China as the most authoritarian model, but Singapore as a quasi authoritarian model, it is something that we may be looking at. Either of you.
Shall I go, Alain?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there is a case built for that is either inevitable or will lead, or in any sense will obviously lead to better outcomes. I think there's all sorts of models that we have explored very poorly or not at all in terms of getting people more connected to these types of decisions. So you look at things like deliberative democracy and you think instead of that move towards more top-down, shouldn't we actually be thinking what are the opportunities to get a more bottom-up connection into these types of political decision making? And I think there's much richer options out there than a choice between our current system and a top-down authoritarian one, and underexplored particularly in the UK. Some genuine movements towards that more deliberative approach across different countries, but really just the experimental stage right now. And I think we've got much more we could learn from that before we decide that is that we have to go in the other direction.
Now, I just want to see if there are anybody in the hall that has questions.
Yes, there are a couple.
I can't see them in chat. So if somebody has a microphone and wants to ask a question.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for the talk. It was really inspiring for us. We are currently students in economics in French University. And I have a question that is bothering me. It's how can we trust someone that is not trusting us? Because we want to make an impact and change the world, but how I can trust the state, even if it's not trusting me? Thank you.
Alain, do you want to come in on that?
Oui, la réponse est dans la question.
The answer is in the question.
On ne peut pas... c'est très bien formulé. Je trouve la question est particulièrement bien formulée.
Your question is very well formulated.
Je disais que le sursaut qui a eu lieu après la Seconde Guerre mondiale, sa nouveauté, ça a été de faire place à une démocratie économique et sociale qui oblige les dirigeants à tenir compte de l'expérience concrète des populations dans l'infinie diversité de leur situation. Et
so the leap that took place after the Second World War was that from a social and economic democratic point of view, the states had to take into consideration what they had actually gone through.
Et nous sommes revenus à une situation, moi je trouve que nous sommes dans une situation assez léniniste, où nous avons des dirigeants qui se considèrent comme une avant-garde éclairée, qui expliquent à des peuples ignorants ce qu'ils doivent faire. Et
we're dealt with leaders who are Leninist, who are explaining to the people precisely how to do things.
Et je défends l'idée que la chute du communisme n'a pas été une victoire des démocraties sur le communisme, mais ça a été le début d'un processus d'hybridation, ça a été un mariage des deux systèmes, et que la formule qu'on trouve dans la constitution chinoise qui définit la Chine comme une dictature démocratique est une formule qui est assez éclairante pour comprendre ce qui se passe aussi dans nos propres pays.
And I don't consider that, in fact, communism was destroyed by democracy. And in fact, China is described as a democratic dictatorship, which I think very well describes what's happening.
Yes, but the point is that, in fact, it wasn't a victory of democracy upon communist countries, but an a kind of marriage, an hybridation of the two systems, you know. And that's why this notion of democratic dictatorship, it seems to me that it's a very interesting one.
Bobby, in the UK at the moment, we've got a government that asks for trust and asks for citizens to behave in a certain way, and yet we have a government that is accused at the center of ignoring all the rules that they have been asking of their citizens. Is that a factor that's going to destroy trust long term?
Yes, it doesn't help, Alan, definitely. it's not a good thing. No, absolutely it does. And it's you can see that looking at the historic trends. The expenses scandal in the UK did hurt trust, and then it took a while to come back to previous levels, and this trusts it too. I think there is a degradation there in terms of the functioning of that system, and that obviously affects people's trust. I mean, I think the question, again, I think a great question, and it does point again to the point that you display trust in other people, in the people. The state displays trust in the people when it brings it into those types of discussions and decisions, and it transfers more of its power to the decision-making power to the people. And that is the theme behind, can we get more deliberative democracy methods built into more devolved decision-making, more deliberative decision-making, because this centralized system leads to, it helps create the conditions where that type of untrustworthy behavior can flourish. So I think it is the point. We need to trust the people in order to earn their trust. That is a key aspect of this.
I think we have one more question from the hall, I hope.
My question's similar to what Alan asked in terms of UK politics, but perhaps a bit more specific in terms of we've seen a slight erosion in terms of separation of the state and the legal system over the last couple of years. We've seen it with Brexit in terms of the haranguing of the judges during I think it was a proroguing of Parliament case. We've seen it with Suella Braverman, Attorney General last year, tweeting about, I think it was the Cummingsgate sort of, Durham scandal. We've seen it with MPs tweeting about the decision about the Colston 5, and then obviously we've seen the Met declining to investigate with Partygate. Now, earlier you were talking about generational gaps in each generation, thinking that that their time is the worst possible political scandal. But from my understanding of UK history, this is the first time we've seen the state transforming itself in this way and really trying to erode at that key separation of power between the judiciary. And I want to get your view on that. Yeah, shall I go, Alan?
Yeah, why don't you?
Yeah. No, I don't disagree. I don't disagree that there is a lot of the pillars that give that sense of stability to the state are under attack right now. So I do think I'm not saying that we're not in a special time of threat. I think what I was trying to say was we have been in similar dark times, not the same sort of dark times in the past, but similar types of dark times, and have managed to turn it round. I think there is a risk in this that you get a sense of inevitable decline. And I suppose that the main message from this, from the analysis of looking at the history, is that we still have agency to deal with those types of things. These things can be under threat and they can be eroded, but they can be protected and rebuilt as well. And that's the key message from it.
Alain, do you want to address this, but also perhaps some final closing remarks?
Eh bien, je pourrais terminer par un conseil, c'est d'aller voir un film, un blockbuster américain qui est pas, je pense qu'il est sorti dans les années 2010, qui s'appelle Elyséeum. C'est un film qui décrit la classe dirigeante s'est réfugiée sur une luxueuse planète, satellite qui tourne autour de la Terre, qui, elle, est devenue une sorte de vaste bidonville. Donc là, il n'y a plus de trust. Et comme souvent, le cinéma, bien plus que les universitaires, nous donne à voir ce qui travaille aujourd'hui les sociétés. Et ce sentiment, effectivement, d'un État qui a perdu le contact avec les conditions concrètes de la vie. Donc, il est urgent qu'il reprenne ce contact.
So I just finished with a piece of advice. I would suggest that you watch a US blockbuster dating from 2010, which is called Elysium. And essentially, the leading class decides to take refuge on a satellite. Essentially, that satellite becomes a large shanty town. Cinema often lets us see precisely what's going on in society. So I think that's why I would advise you to see that film.
Okay, that's a very good recommendation. Bobby, is there anything that you want to just close down with?
No, I can't top that, Alan. That's let's leave a cinema with a movie recommendation. That seems very fitting.
That's brilliant. Well, we've got exactly 1 minute to go, so I just want to use that to thank Bobby, to thank Alain, to thank Karine for her excellent translation. And I should probably be remiss if I didn't mention that the new edition of Prospect is out today, and it's got a lead feature on the BBC, which is also an example of an institution that I would say was trusted and necessary in a world that Bobby describes of polarization and fragmentation. So do read Prospect, and thank you for coming tonight. Thank you if you've been watching from home, and I will hand you back to the organizers. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Alain Rusbridger, Bobby Duffy, Alain Supiot, and Karine Kennedy, merci. I've seen that film, Elysium. It's very good, actually. He's right. Good choice. Another film recommendation is Parallel Mothers by Pedro Almodovar, starring Penelope Cruz. It's going to be here on this screen this weekend. So I thoroughly recommend here and that film. Well, we're at film recommendations, and you can listen to my podcast, Seen Any Good Films Lately. Right, that's the plug for me, over. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, what an amazing night, a night of ideas that have included the BBC, spaceships, rescuing rich people, new planets, new ideas, poetry. It's been extraordinary. I hope you've had your synapses tickled by the ideas wherever you are in the world. It's not over yet here on the Institut Français. We have some music for you to finish the evening. So if you'd like to make your way to the library, you can listen to some music. If not, just thank the organisers of the La Nuit des Idées, wherever they are in the world, the French Culture Institute, and thank Ideas. Ideas, I think, are sentiments that we haven't quite put words to. This is what my idea for the night is. Sentiments that have bubbled under, been in our head, and we haven't expressed them, haven't come out in concrete word form. Well, they have tonight in many fantastic words. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for being with us. Bonsoir.